we have found an attempt by the white to overwhelm the black and to put a shadow over the black. We have found in many cultures and civilizations of the world an attempt to put the woman under the shadow of man's ego. This has not been so in Africa as it has been in Europe and Asia. I'm not going to present to you some idyllic story of the African respect for the woman. It is rooted not in simple idyllic legends, it is rooted in a profound creation myth. We have been taught, and perhaps it was just a symbolic story or an allegorical fable, but we have been taught that man began in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Now that story, like the beginnings of man in the Bible, is not supposed to be taken literally, because man has no knowledge of how he began, except on this planet. Man has no knowledge about how the universe began. Within the last few years, we have come very close to understanding how the universe began. Bell Labs, some years ago, found the noise that is behind the universe, a noise that will never pass, because that represents, they say, the bang, the first big bang out of which this universe came, the tremendous explosion of the universe. But the more we look at the universe, the more we become aware of its extraordinary complexity and its extraordinary size. Last week, it was discovered, in fact, that we have only observed or have only intuited 1/10 of the mass in the universe. However, in spite of the mystery and the magic that still surrounds us, one thing we are very clear about now: we do know how man came on this planet, and we do know beyond the shadow of a doubt that that first man was African. And we do know now something further which is far more important, and that is that all creatures now living on the earth that are called Homo sapiens sapiens come from a black woman of about 120 to 140,000 years ago. Just a few years ago, this was not known. This is very, very recent. We have known for a long time that humankind, man and woman, was born in Africa. That does not mean a thing. Apes were born in Africa too. So that by itself meant absolutely nothing. What we have recently discovered is far, far more important. What they have discovered is that not only the first man and woman was born in Africa, but the last man, the last stage of man and woman was born in Africa. There are 6 stages in the development of humankind, and if I use the term man, forgive me, it is not sexist, it's a habit. There are 6 stages in the development of man, and it was assumed that man came out of Africa at a very primitive, low-level stage, and then he evolved the highest stage in Europe and Asia. So that when I was going to university, if it were ever raised that man was born in Africa, my professor, whether he was in Europe or America, would say, fine, we all know that, we all accept that, but that doesn't mean that they're equal. All it means is that man came out at a very crude, incomplete stage, black, yes, but then he emerged into higher refined white type, which developed civilization and then brought it back to the unfortunate benighted barbarians in Africa. So that the fact that man was born in Africa was not anything of lasting significance. Then came an extraordinary study which was only published about 1.5 years ago. Oxford, of all places, Oxford, one of the most conservative universities in the world, one of the first universities in Europe, published a study from 11 doctors which claimed with scientific precision that there was now no doubt that the African provided the founding population of the modern world. In other words, the last man on earth. The final stage of man, the most evolved stage of man, carrying the brain case of modern man with the size and convolutions of the brain of modern man, was an African. And since then, studies have come out of Hawaii, studies have come out of California, which shows that a black woman mothered all people on the planet at this time. And they have been able to trace it through blood studies, DNA, analysis of DNA polymorphisms, and they could show you that the black woman carries everything no other woman does. She carries every element. There is a certain stage at which there's a break-off, and one of those elements is just resides in her. It doesn't reside in other people. It doesn't make them inferior, but it makes it quite clear that they are branches, mutations, extensions of that central woman. Hence, the myth we have in the Bible, and we are not attacking the Bible, because you have to understand it was necessary for the early patriarchs who wrote the Bible, and the Bible is full of truth, historical truth. Do not dismiss it, but it was necessary for the early patriarchs who had no idea of what had happened, who had no idea about beginnings, and who assumed that their theories and assumptions came to them from God above. It was only natural for them to assume, since they were in charge and they were male, that God created the male first, and then he took a rib out of the complex male and made woman. Woman, in fact, is physiologically more complex than the male. Hence, women cannot come out of men. Eve cannot come out of Adam. Only Adam can come out of Eve. The Africans did not have that absurd theory of events. The Africans had created the myth of Isis and Osiris. Isis and Osiris, unlike Adam and Eve, gives you a vision of the completeness of the human through the equality of the male and the female. God is not a man. God is not a woman. God comprises both. And the strange story of Isis, the great black goddess searching for Osiris, the great black god, is that you find that Set, which became the prototype for Satan, that's African, by the way. All of these concepts are created, strangely enough. We find it after so many hundreds of years in Africa. Satan is Egyptian. Satan is a force, the dark force, the evil force. Let me not use words like dark, the evil force. Satan destroys Osiris, and he's split into many pieces, and Isis goes searching for Osiris, and she finds most of the pieces, but there is one piece missing. We need not name that piece. It is the piece that is absent in woman and present in man. But that piece cannot make sense without the woman. In other words, that piece is what completes them. So that it is not as if you have the great male god and the inferior female god. She becomes the sister, the wife, the mother. She is all that is female in the female principle of the universe, and he is all that is the male principle of the universe, which completes the universe in order to create life. So that you have a vision of creation complete through the woman that you do not find in the early absurd imaginative version that you find in the Adam and Eve myth. That Adam and Eve myth, interpreted as it was later on in history, led to profound conceptions of the woman as inferior, and sometimes in some civilizations as essentially evil. So she's supposed to be the great seductress, the weaker kind, etc. This was not the case. in the African mythology. So that you already had a divine myth which gave a basis. It was a sort of bedrock for a reality that could give the woman greater freedom and power. It is not an accident, therefore, that many of the goddesses of the Europeans were black. They could have chosen their own women, they chose some of their own women, but the most important goddesses were black. Not just for the African now, in the civilization of the Greek. The Greek was so profoundly affected by the Africans that the goddess of chastity was a black woman, Artemis. The goddess of wisdom was a black woman, Minerva. The goddess of beauty was a black woman, Diana. And many of their great mythological figures which were critical to the vision of history, the history of the Greeks in the Odyssey, the woman who draws, who has the power to draw Odysseus and all his crew into her, is Circe, who is represented as a black woman with African features on the Greek vases. The woman who helps Jason win the Golden Fleece is a black woman, Medea. The woman who marries Perseus, the Greek hero, is a black woman, Andromeda. If you see them represented in Hollywood, they're all white. But if you go back to the original vases, the original art of the Greeks, you will find that the only women they could find to represent the finest attributes in the feminine world were black women. Actual black women. They were literally living black women in Ethiopia who were made into legendary goddesses in Greece. That first invasion of Africa by Europe was not an invasion like the invasions that occurred later. The European was startled by the advances of the African. So startled that Alexander decided to build his capital in Africa rather than go back into Europe. And every major Greek thinker, Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, they all came down. Plato, all of them came into Egypt. And those who did not come claimed they came because it was so prestigious. And they therefore saw women differently. In this new edition of Black Women in Antiquity, there is a remarkable woman called Hypatia. For a long time we thought she was a Greek woman, until Beatrice Lumpkin, doing studies in the rights of women in ancient Greece, found that black women had power and freedoms that the white woman was not allowed. The Greek woman could not head a department in a university, but she could in Egypt. She could not pursue a scientific pursuit without a companion or someone in charge of her. It was possible in Egypt, so that when she studied Hypatia and the freedoms Hypatia had and the kind of work she was doing, it was easy to come to the conclusion no Greek woman at the time was allowed those opportunities. And in that Alexandrian world where you have a mix later of the Greek and the African, you find the African woman has certain advantages that the Greek woman does not have and was not to have for a long time to come. Now, Isis, the great goddess, affected, as I say, Europe as deeply as she affected Africa. All major European powers built shrines to the black goddess Isis. Even the Roman lunatic Caligula built a shrine to Isis. Out in the British Isles we find shrines to Isis. That was the beginning of the Black Madonna. You go to Nuria in Spain, not just black with Africoid features. Some of them later on became black-skinned but with European features, because as some of them became destroyed or lost or broken, they would build them again and retain the blackness of ancient times, but they would give them European-type features. Sometimes the child would be African, but the woman would have a European face but a black skin. And then later when this was found, and of course the movement against the African, or the reduction of the African, became something that became significant in the life of Europe, then they would try to explain it away. The reason why it looks black is because it's been gathering dust over the ages.